Hello viewers, and welcome to this session on a story titled Mumu by Ivan Sergeyevich Turgenev. Mumu is a terrible story that, better than any manifesto, indicted the absolute tyrannical cruelty of pre-revolutionary landowners in Russia. Till 1861, there was serfdom prevailing in Russia. The serfs were living a very pathetic life. For every small event like getting a daughter married, naming the newborn child, buying clothes for the child, solving disputes between themselves, etc., they had to depend on the landlord. The landlords were very cruel. Many poets and writers depicted the life of serfs in their works. Many social movements led to the abolition of this law. Mumu depicts life of aristocrats as well as of serfs. The Russian novelist, dramatist and short story writer Ivan Sergeyevich Turgenev as one of the greatest stylists in the Russian language. The life of Ivan Turgenev is woven like a bright thread throughout Russian history of the 19th century, which is considered as the golden age of Russian literature. He was the first Russian author to establish a European reputation, and during his long years abroad, he was friends with Gustave Flaubert, Henry James, Émile Zola and Guy de Maupassant and many other writers. Turgenev's generous enthusiasm for the work of other men made him a perfect mediator between the East and the West. Turgenev was born in a very rich family. His mother ruled with an iron hand over her vast estates and 5,000 serfs. Father, who was a hussar, paid little attention to the family matters. Turgenev was born the second of 3 sons at the family seat of Spasskoye in Orel province on November 9, 1818. He was educated by private tutors at Spasskoye until he was 9 years old. Only French was spoken at home, so he learned Russian mainly from family servants. In 1827, he attended various preparatory schools in Moscow, entering the university there in 1833. Already, he was rebelling against his aristocratic background. In 1834, he was transferred to the University of St. Petersburg, where the family moved to the capital. The father died the same autumn. At this time, Turgenev aspired to become a university professor and wrote poetry in his spare time. His first work, a Gothic melodrama in verse, was severely criticized by his favorite professor P. A. Platonov. However, in 1838, Platonov published Turgenev's first poetry in contemporary. Meanwhile, having finished his courses at St. Petersburg, Turgenev resolved upon further study at the University of Berlin. In Berlin, Turgenev studied Latin, Greek and philosophy, immersing himself in the works of G.W.H. Hegel. In July 1840, Turgenev met Mikhail Bakunin, and for a whole year they lived together arguing philosophy day and night. In 1841, Turgenev returned to Russia. For various reasons, he abandoned his plans for an academic career and entered the Ministry of Interior Affairs. He left the civil service after 18 months. His mother was infuriated and cut off his funds, thus forcing him to lead a rather precarious existence. Turgenev met the critic Vissarion Belinsky, with whom he remained very close until the latter's death. Belinsky was instrumental in turning the young man away from vaporous poetry to a greater realism and a more natural tone. From 1845 to 1847, Turgenev spent most of his time in Russia, plunging now into his nation's literary life, coming into contact with all its leading literary figures. In 1847, he went abroad, resolved to fight serfdom with his pen. That year, he wrote the first of his hunter sketches, A Sportsman's Sketches. In 1850, Turgenev returned to Russia, where his mother lay dying. Her death made him master of 11 estates, including Spasskoye, some 30,000 acres with thousands of serfs. He did his best to lighten the load of these peasants, and he freed the household workers among them. More of the hunter sketches appeared at frequent intervals during these years. In many of them, the serfs seemed nobler than their masters, and both master and serf seemed stunted by the institution of serfdom. The sketches angered the government. The stage for some action against Turgenev was set. In November 1852, he wrote a laudatory article on the recently dead author Nikolai Gogol. This article was not passed by St. Petersburg censors. Turgenev then took it to Moscow, where it was published. Its publication was regarded as a treasonable act. He was arrested, and after a month in prison, he was put under house arrest at Spasskoye for almost 2 years. The greatest irony was that after his arrest, the collected hunter sketches were published in a book form. The volume created a revulsion against serfdom much greater than the separate sketches had. In 1854, Turgenev was back in St. Petersburg. He had long felt the need to experiment with a longer form, and after several false starts wrote his first novel, Rudin, which appeared in 1856. His masterpiece, Fathers and Sons, appeared in 1862. The novel marked a watershed in literary, intellectual and political life of Russia. Everyone was forced to take sides on the issue of Bazarov, the book's hero, and his nihilist philosophy. Bazarov became the archetype for the generation of the 1860s. He was a socialist in politics and a scientific materialist in philosophy. Conservatives accused Turgenev of prostrating himself before the younger generation, while radicals charged him with a cruel satire of their ideals. Some felt that Bazarov was a parody of the radical critic Dobroliubov, who had died tragically young. Turgenev was afflicted with cancer of the spine and died on September 3, 1883. In 1852, when Turgenev was in jail for writing an article about Nikolai Gogol, the Tsarist regime got angry and imprisoned him. He was sent to a jail for 1 month. There, in the neighborhood, he could hear the shrieks of serfs who were regularly beaten by their masters. This was the time when serfdom was not yet abolished in Russia, and the serfs lived a very miserable life. Even for small decisions of their life, they would have to seek the master's permission. Memories of childhood became fresh in Turgenev's mind, and he wrote Mumu. It is based on a similar incident which had taken place in this estate. His mother, who was very cruel, serves as prototype for the old landlady, and Andrei, a dumb and deaf serf, is portrayed as Gerasim. Thomas Carlyle calls Mumu as the most pathetic story in the world. Gerasim is a deaf and dumb peasant brought from the country to serve his mistress, modelled on Turgenev's monstrous mother, as caretaker of her city property on the outskirts of Moscow. He doesn't like his new life, but gets used to it, especially after he rescues a little puppy with black and white spots from the riverbank. Having this dog, Mumu, He finally has love in his bitter and otherwise loveless life, and the dog worships him. But one day the mistress notices her in the garden and calls for Mumu to be brought to her. But Mumu was shy of her and bared its teeth at her approach. The mistress was stung to a fury, and she ordered, "See that she isn't here today. Do you hear?" Her butler, Gavrilo, tries to sell Mumu, but she finds her way back. Gerasim hides the dog, but the mistress comes to know of her presence when Mumu starts barking at an intruder. This time the writing is on the wall. Gerasim is ordered to hand Mumu over to be destroyed. The mistress will not have that ungrateful dog disturbing her rest. An hour after all this commotion, the door of the box room opened and Gerasim appeared. He had his Sunday coat on. He was leading Mumu by a string. Yeroshka got out of the way and let him pass. Gerasim went to the gates. All the small boys in the yard followed him with their eyes in silence. He did not even turn round and only put on his cap in the street. Gavrilo sent Yeroshka after him in the role of an observer. Seeing from a distance that he had gone to an inn with a dog, Yeroshka waited for him to come out again. In the inn they knew Gerasim and understood his signs. He ordered some cabbage soup with boiled meat and sat down, leaning on the table with his arms. Mumu stood beside his chair, watching him calmly with her clever little eyes. Her coat was glossy. It was evident that she had just been thoroughly brushed. They brought Gerasim the cabbage soup. He crumbled some bread into it, cut the meat into very small pieces, and put the plate on the floor. Mumu began to eat with her usual refinement, hardly touching her food with her little muzzle. Gerasim gazed at her for a long time. 2 big tears suddenly rolled out of his eyes. One fell on the dog's craggy little forehead and the other into the cabbage soup. He covered his face with his hand. Mumu ate up half the meat on the plate and walked away from it, licking her chops. Gerasim got up, paid for the cabbage soup and went out, accompanied by the somewhat perplexed glances of the waiter. Yeroshka, catching sight of Gerasim, darted round a corner and, letting him go on, followed him again. Gerasim walked unhurriedly, without letting Mumu off the string. At the Crimean ford, he walked along the bank of the river, went up to the place where there were 2 little rowing boats tied to the pegs. He had noticed them before, and jumped into one of them together with Mumu. Gerasim rode on and on. Soon Moscow was left behind. Soon meadows, kitchen gardens, fields and copses stretched on either side of the bank, and peasants' cottages appeared. There came a breadth of open country. He threw down the oars, put his head close to Mumu, who sat before him on a dry cross seat. The bottom of the boat was full of water, and remained motionless, his powerful hands crossed on her back, while the boat was gradually carried back by the current towards the town. At last Gerasim sat up hurriedly with an expression of painful bitterness on his face, tied the bricks he had taken with a rope, made a running noose, put it round Mumu's neck, lifted her up over the river, and looked at her for the last time. She looked at him trustingly and without fear, and wagged her tail slightly. He turned away, shut his eyes, and opened his hands. Gerasim heard nothing, neither the quick shrill yelp of the falling Mumu, nor the heavy splash of the water. For him the noisy day was soundless and silent, as no still night is silent to us. And when he opened his eyes again, little waves as before were hurrying over the river, as though chasing each other, and as before rippled against the 2 sides of the boat. and only far away behind some wide circles was spreading out towards the bank. Gerasim then came back to his native village and stayed there forever. Never in his life did he possess a dog nor love any woman. Gerasim is shown as a very strong and powerful man. He is 6 feet 5 inches tall. He is deaf and dumb. He works with great efficiency and pleasure. It was sheer joy to see him working. Gerasim expresses himself only with signs. He has a soft, affectionate heart, not scared of anyone, but he does not indulge in hooliganism. He is a man of free will, but is not free to act as per his wish. Gerasim falls in love with Tatiana, the washerwoman, who is also a serf. Tatiana understands his feelings but cannot reciprocate out of fear. The mistress decides that Tatiana should marry a lazy shoemaker, Kopitov. Though Gerasim is strong and he can easily defy the orders of the landlady, he is aware that he is a serf and that he has to obey her orders. So he lets Tatiana's marriage take place and tries to forget her. He is gloomy for a few days till he finds Mumu. Mumu is everything for Gerasim, but when he comes to know that the lady wants Mumu to be eliminated, he himself drowns her. But then he never returned to the landlady. He shows courage and runs away to his native village. Bitter experience of unsuccessful love, twice, has taught him a lot, and he never loved any woman again, nor did he marry and never had a dog. Gerasim is thus a powerful giant who has been chained and has buried all the tender feelings of his heart. But Gerasim is not all that pitiable. People are afraid of him. They don't dare argue with him or irritate him. We feel a little sorry when Tatiana and Mumu are separated from him, but his last act of defiance, by which he frees himself and goes back to his native village, deserves appreciation. Turgenev symbolically depicts the serfed Russia through Gerasim's portrait and shows its freedom by his last act. There are two female characters in Mumu, the landlady and Tatiana. They are the exploiter and the exploited. Turgenev never mentions the name of the landlady. She is only a power, hated but tolerated by the people surrounding her. The old lady has had a very unhappy life, and now she is approaching her end too hopelessly. She is never loved by anyone in the family, and hence she can't see love, affection flourishing in her vicinity. She has no love for anyone. She wants to possess everything which is beautiful and useful. At the slightest sign of protest from the other side, she doesn't hesitate to annihilate them. She knows very well that Gerasim loves Tatiana, the washerwoman. But even then she orders that Tatiana be married to a drunkard, because everyone is aware of Gerasim's love for Tatiana and is scared of the giant. But the old despot spoils the game and orders that Tatiana be married to Kopitov. She can only poison the life of others. She snatches away all that they love. When Mumu is brought to her and she refuses to go near the landlady, she gets stung by extreme anger. She complains that the dog barks the whole night, spoils her sleep, and hence be taken away from her estate. Mumu is sold out, but she comes back to Gerasim. This time the landlady orders that she be taken care of. Gerasim gets an idea of the landlady's intentions and himself drowns Mumu into the river. The landlady dies a few days after Gerasim has run away from her estate. She cries foul but doesn't insist that he be brought back. The landlady dies. Symbolically, It is the death of serfdom in Russia and freedom for serfs like Gerasim. The other woman in the story is Tatiana. Tatiana is not deaf and dumb, but she too can't express herself. Tatiana can guess from Gerasim's gestures that he loves her. She too develops a liking for him, but she's too scared of the landlady and knows that she has to follow her commands. She does not ask any questions, doesn't reveal to anyone that she too loves Gerasim, and agrees to the landlady's desire to marry the drunkard shoemaker. Only when she is leaving the village after marriage and Gerasim follows her for a long distance, she bursts into tears while receiving the red handkerchief which Gerasim presents her. Gerasim, as we know, is deaf and mute. Though he has a physique like Hercules, he is a good and honest worker. He does not express any of his desires through his body language. He lets Tatiana go off with the shoemaker when the landlady desires so. He drowns Mumu in the river when he notices that if he doesn't do so, she will get him killed anyway. Then he disappears, never returns to the landlady, and goes back to his native village. The question arises, if he had decided to run away from Moscow to his native village, why did he drown Mumu? He could have gone along with her. Maybe. He not only defied the landlady by not coming back to her, he took revenge upon her by drowning Mumu, whom the landlady too wanted to possess. She deprived him of his love, and he repaid her the same coin. Thus, he shot two birds with one arrow, attained freedom for himself, and punished the landlady for snatching away Tatiana from him. He knew very well that the landlady would anyway get Mumu killed, no matter wherever he takes her. He was unaware of the unlimited power that the landlords enjoyed, so he deprives her of that pleasure as well. Ivan Turgenev was a very well-mannered and sophisticated gentleman. Even if he was angry, he would not shout at anyone, but express his anger symbolically. The same thing is noticed in Mumu as well. To avoid the use of bad language which the landowner would normally use for her serfs, he makes less use of dialogues. Turgenev highlights persona of his characters by their actions, by their body language. He uses many comparisons to show the physical strength and the soft nature of Gerasim. Gerasim's helplessness too is expressed by his actions. They are so touchy, like handing over a red flower to Tatiana and gifting her a red handkerchief when she is leaving after marriage. Turgenev was a master of wordless expressions. Tatiana's helplessness, her love and her fear of both Gerasim and her mistress too are depicted without the use of any dialogues or monologues. Turgenev's portrayal of Gerasim and Tatiana is just superb. Turgenev is difficult to translate. The language is too deeply rooted in the nature and heart of Russia, so the English translations are not as enjoyable as the story in its Russian version. We can say that by portraying Gerasim as deaf and dumb, Turgenev describes just a person, but a serf. And as a serf has no voice, he can't protest. The cruelty and whimsicality of the landlady too describes the nature of aristocracy, the exploiters. But Turgenev is optimistic. He shows the last act of the mute but successful protest by Gerasim, thereby indicating the mood of a nation, which was also heading slowly and silently towards the abolition of serfdom. With this, we come to the end of this session on Mumu by Ivan Turgenev. I hope you enjoyed listening to this session. See you in the next session. Thank you.